Humphreys, Director of ACP Conservation Group. I've been working for the last 25 plus years in the historic environment, about 8 years with English Heritage. I have a number of strings to my bow, and about 3 years ago I became very interested in historic ironwork, because I began to see, as I went around to historic graveyards and sites, that a lot of the ironwork was there. It really wasn't visible, and I decided at that stage I'd start, under the tutelage of a very good friend of mine in Holland. I started to learn through the skills of a blacksmith in this. I'm not a blacksmith, I don't ever want to be a blacksmith, but my knowledge and what I'm learning in the training as a blacksmith is now helping me to understand how we can approach and conserve the historic ironworks in our graveyards, in our towns, in our houses, in our cities. So the outline of the lecture, very quickly, I want to do a very brief introduction to iron and the types of iron we use. A brief history on that, the types of iron, their use in graveyards, and I have some samples that I've brought with me so that you begin to see what is out there, because it's there, it's really a matter of looking for it. And the current status of that and where we're going. So let's have a look. Iron. Iron has been around and in man's use for nearly 3,000 years. We all heard of the Iron Age, and we kind of think the Iron Age finished maybe 1,000 years. It hasn't really. Iron is still one of the biggest industrial products that's been used today. All our cars, armaments, everything is made out of iron. In fact, what we call it now is steel. But it's essentially iron with some carbon in it. Iron ore is made up of about 5% of the Earth's crust, so there's lots of it around. Dick and I attended a talk recently in Ennis, where the talk was about families in East Clare, and it really began to develop into why these families were there, and there was a whole iron ore smelting industry over in East Clare, around Scariff, Mount Shannon and so on. Forgotten about, but 300-400 years ago it was a major employer. So we have a tradition and a history of iron smelting in Ireland. So as the iron, it's like a lump of a rock. It's smelted, it's heated, and you get a bloom of iron. The bloom of iron is basically a lump of raw iron with a lot of impurities. And that is hammered in a traditional way and heated, and the impurities are driven out of it. And you end up with wrought iron. In the case, we often heard of the word cast iron. Cast iron is another type of iron. The only difference between cast iron and wrought iron is the amount of carbon in it, and we'll come back to that. So there, your bloom of iron, hammered and drive out the impurities. That gives you wrought iron. Now I have some samples and I'll explain to you what they are in a few minutes. The wrought iron that we hear people talking about today, wrought iron this, wrought iron that, it's all steel, mild steel. Wrought iron in traditional sense is a completely different product. Blacksmiths that have worked it understand that it's a completely different material to work. It's softer, it's more difficult to work than mild steel because there's grain in it, but that's mostly what we have in graveyards, wrought iron. And like what Dick was saying earlier about cement and lime, they're not compatible. Wrought iron and mild steel, no matter what they tell you, are not compatible, more or less for the same reasons. The blast furnace was a big invention where the iron was heated up with the aid of a large air blowing system, and you started getting what we call pig iron, and that started to get us into the cast iron system. And in England, in Coalbrookdale, around the mid-1700s, you had this revolution, the start of the Industrial Revolution, where they started to make things out of iron. And by the end of the 19th century, all over England, particularly in Glasgow and in other centres, you had huge factories employing thousands of people, generating all sorts of products in wrought iron and cast iron. Some of the catalogues, if you can find any, could be that thick, of hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of products. They were almost like what we regard today as you can buy anything in plastic. 100 years ago you could buy anything in wrought iron. Okay, the Bessemer converter came in and allowed the making of steel, which steel started to come in really into prominence about the 1860s on. And steel is what we have today. We have all sorts of steel, a couple of hundred different types. You have the steel that goes into steel knives, you have mild steel, you have all sorts of different hardened steels for excavators, for parts of tractors and so on. So let's look at wrought iron and mild steel. Wrought iron, on the left is a wrought iron gate. You will find some of the telltale signs are there's no welding. The joints are made much as would have been done if you were doing carpentry. You'll have mortise and tenons. You'll have fire welding. You'll have where you might have a little stud taped off at both sides. So those type of techniques are used. A lot of them are no longer there. In a mild steel, modern so-called wrought iron gate, you get the mild steel coming in, you'll have the castings possibly brought in from China, they'll be welded on, and hey presto, you have a so-called wrought iron gate. It's mild steel. Now, if you try and mix the both, if you have a wrought iron gate and you try and get someone, a fabricator, to put the two together and repair it using fabrication techniques, you'll end up with the same problems as you will have if you're trying to combine cement into stone walls. They're not compatible, they set up all sorts of problems, and in the medium to longer term, you are doing the old ironwork an awful lot of harm. So what we've got in terms of wrought iron, it's somewhere between 0.02 and 0.08% carbon. And that's the difference. You've cast iron, which is much higher in carbon. Cast iron is very strong in compression. If you see any old Victorian railway stations and you're walking along and you see that the roof is held up by these pillars. The pillars are cast iron because they're being pressed down, they won't break. But if you go and hit that with a sledge or you go and you break it sideways, it'll snap. They're very strong in compression, very weak in tension. Wrought iron is very good in tension. Mild steel, again, carbon between 0.2 and 1.5, and that's essentially the difference. Wrought iron, sadly, is no longer available. You can get some recycled coming in from England, where some old chains from some of the old ships are now being recycled. A lot of problems with salts and stuff that are in them, but at least there's a source, but it is maybe 10 times more expensive than mild steel. So the gate, the old farm gate that you have thrown in the ditch, that it's overgrown with briars, the actual iron in that is a lot more valuable than you think. It's not just worth the 2 and 6pence that you get off of Hegarty's inside in Limerick. There might be a couple of €100 worth of wrought iron in it. So the historic iron that we're really dealing with is wrought iron or cast iron, or a combination where both are used. It is not steel. So when you go out to the graveyard and you see an old railing around a gravestone or a burial, and it's rusting away and it looks terrible, remember that it's a very old material, you can't get it anymore, and it was made more than likely by some local blacksmith who used what he basically had available to him locally. And that's the kind of thinking we need to be thinking about. It's a part of not just, it's a rare material, but it's part of our heritage that was built, that was made locally. Someone came in, there was a bereavement in the family, and they maybe had just enough to try and get a small cross made. They went to the blacksmith and said, "What have you got?" And he might have a piece of an old band wheel. and he would have made something out of that, made a nice little cross. So our traditional materials require traditional techniques. So I suppose the questions we need to be thinking about, is there historic ironwork in our graveyards? I bet you there is. I've visited hundreds, maybe more, graveyards in the last 3 years, and every one of them has more or less the same. The bits of iron forgotten, lost, and left out of the way. Where will we find iron in the graveyards? Well, we'll find it as grave markers, railings around monuments, railings around just the graves on top of very nice cut stone plinths and so on. And you'll also find maybe a small little cross that's abandoned at the end of the graveyard, where it's just a marker, no name, no nothing. So I suppose the other thing we need to be thinking, are we aware of it, and its importance? I suggest that we should be opening our eyes a little bit and becoming more aware of it, and starting to realise it is important. It's an important part of our local heritage. It was made locally. The iron might have come from East Clare. In the more sophisticated stuff, it might have been imported in from Glasgow, but the simpler stuff may have been locally. And was it made by a local blacksmith? If it's a very nice piece, you may find the initials or some marker that the local blacksmith would have put to identify his work. And it's there. Now, if we look at our graveyards, and you look at any documentation, Heritage Council document, talking about graveyards, stone, grave markers, no bit of iron. Any photographs you'll see around stone, monuments, stone headstones, etc. And maybe in this case, you might find somewhere in the background there's a bit of railing that's rusting away, forgotten. So let's look at wrought iron, the first type, wrought iron, forged wrought iron. This is a piece that was made locally, a piece of half-inch round bar. The blacksmith he tapered it out into a point, and put a very nice little groove along the outside. And you can just see that may not have had any maintenance maybe for 100 to 150 years. And it's still more or less perfect, except his pitting and bits of rust. The reason it's rusty and pits like that is because of the impurities. The second one I want to show you passing around is, just look at the top corner, all right? You can look and you'll see that the grain of the iron is actually almost, there's a grain in it. It's not smooth. And that's one of the indications that you've wrought iron. So if you pass those around, you'll see the difference. In this case here, possibly someone local died. Someone in the family went to the blacksmith locally and said, "What have you got? He has maybe 5 shillings or something." That's a piece of a band wheel, riveted together in the centre, and the blacksmith split the top end, drew it out into 2 points, and turned them over the beak of the anvil. And you have a very nice little finish and a decorative detail. And you can just see there possibly was a name plaque on it. That was made locally, and I would say is just as valuable as anything else that's in the graveyard. But we all walk into the graveyard and we see this and we ignore it. But when you look a little bit closer, it's different. You're going to a mausoleum. Lots of them around. The door is usually quite substantial. Cast iron. And a lot of people kind of wonder what sort of iron it is, and they try and weld it, and they try and do this, that and the other thing. Cast iron is a difficult material to work with. But bear in mind, they're cast. They possibly were casted in maybe a foundry in Limerick, or even brought in from Glasgow. And you'll see, in this case, the family name Wilkinson was cast into the door. And that's in place. That has had no maintenance whatsoever for the last 150 years. Still perfect. Weathered fine. Maybe a small bit of patination, tiny bit of rust. Nothing dangerous. Another one, name plaque. you'll find them. Cast iron again. That one there, if we could get up close to it, you'll find that that was specially commissioned by the family. The name of the person, the date of their birth, burial, the whole lot, was sent on to the manufacturer. They made a sand mould with that detail, poured the hot iron into it, sent them this. These things were in the late 1800s, you could buy them straight off a catalogue. These are just small samples of what you might find as well. That's a little cast iron decorative corner for a grave, where you would have had a piece of cast iron chain linked off it and around a grave marker. Now you might look at that and say, how did they make that? It's cast iron. It's not made in a forge. This piece here, the main stem is cast, but you notice that the hook, there's a little thread in it, pass it around and you see that's wrought iron. Folded in and screwed into the cast. So you just pass those two around as well. Those have had no treatment whatsoever in maybe 150 years. They're just thrown in the grass, lost, and they're fine. So now you have a combination where you have both. You'll find around burials, you have sometimes very simple cast elements like little stands and a wrought iron railing between them. Or you might have various varieties. And some of them have very nice stone plinths on them. In this one here, you can see that the stone is quite decorative and it's set into the stone plinth using lead. And the danger, I think, in trying to do something here is that when you're taking off the iron to do repairs in it, you end up making bits of the lead. The stone. So you need to be careful. Other feature you'll find, maybe decorative railing. In this case, you have a very, very nicely forged piece of decorative railing, some very nice scrolls, some very nice pieces of fire welding, and they're almost like, what are those things you put into your whiskey? Cloves. Very nice little cloves, right on top. They're cast, and if we were able to look at them in detail, they were leaded into a spike that was on the wrought iron. But again, that has had no maintenance. Maybe that mausoleum was put up about 1860, no maintenance. The family that owns the mausoleum about 2 years ago spent an awful lot of money refurbishing the mausoleum, fixing the stone, fixing this, that and the other thing. They never even looked at the lovely wrought iron railing that's out in the front. We don't see it. It's not on the horizon at the moment. So it's really unseen before our eyes, and this is what we have in graveyards. What would have been a very nice feature at some point when it was built first is now fallen asunder. And sometimes you go into a graveyard and you'll find a lovely piece of railing that's maybe thrown below in the back in the bushes and the briars. That particular piece is nearly 30 foot long, of one single piece of wrought iron with vertical elements of about 4 foot. When I saw that, I was wondering what sort of a grave that marked. It was just thrown there. So now we have our skills. We've lost the skills. Many of our blacksmiths finished up, packed in the 60s and 70s. I remember as a small child going to our local blacksmith, who was my uncle, and sitting down there with the older men, giving hours, listening to the chat and the smell of the burning horse hooves and all of that. It has a certain type of atmosphere that's gone, and the skills have gone with it. St. Cróinin's Church in Cróinín, and I'll finish up on this because there's a gate there. I don't know if some of you are familiar with it, but there's some beautiful pieces of decorative iron in it. First piece, if we look at the latch, we have a situation where you have a very simple piece of iron tapered out into a point and scrolled into a very nice scroll. You have this piece here riveted back onto the back of it. You have a very interesting hinge here riveted onto this. The two holes that these were done, that have gone through, were possibly punched through, with not drilled, and so on. This is one of the vertical, the horizontal bars, and the vertical, or the semicircular piece going around it. And how they managed that was the blacksmith would have heated this part of the flat bar, punched through there, and made up a piece that actually expanded it out to the size he wanted. It was way oversized, because in trying to put the whole lot together, he needed a lot of flexibility in that joint. But when it was together, he filled it up with lead. So if you went at that to repair it, you'd find that this very big hole would start to appear because all the lead had run out. Again, you can see where it's beginning to erode, but that's a fantastic gate. There could have been 2 months' work in that gate for maybe two blacksmiths. So what we're faced with is this conflict between the modern approach and the traditional approach. And it's no different than when you're talking about the stonemasons. This is the same issues. We're trying to combine modern and traditional, and they're not compatible. Modern materials, you use the guy with the welder. If you have traditional iron, wrought iron, cast iron, you go to someone that knows what they're at. A blacksmith that's trained, or someone else. Do not mix the two. Fabricators, lots of them about, making a good living out of fabrication. This slide here shows a situation that I discovered about a year and a half ago, where I was doing a survey for a local authority on a building. And the owner was telling me about the work, the lot of money they had spent repairing the railings and the gate on the entrance, a fabulous entrance. A big semicircular set of iron, lovely wrought iron gates. And I had an old photograph, so I was looking forward to this. And as I went down to look at this, I began to see, well, hang on, this doesn't look exactly what I thought it might be. And it wasn't. The company that did the repairs went down, cut all of the iron off, took it over to Hegarty's, gone, and replaced it with a completely modern makeup. If you look detail, you will find here, just get out of the way, that's the original stub that the gates were hung off of. Got an angle grinder, gone. This flat plate, 4 Hilti bolts, welded on a piece of threaded bar on a nut so they could adjust it. And then this is a completely modern fabricated gate. Cast elements brought in from China more than likely. 12mm long bar, 25mm square, and so on. The only piece of the original iron that was there was a small piece of about that size of one of the broken off original finials that was on the thing. Now, the owner had thought he'd done the right thing because he got in who he thought was got the right advice. He lost everything. And, it's a real tragedy. Worse than that, if you look, you'll see it maybe on the handle. Well, on the bottom of the slide in the centre, when they went taken off the original railing, they got a Kango hammer and made absolutely bits of the lovely cut stone plinth that it was on. Now, if anyone tries to tell me that's good restoration, well, I want to really think again. So where are we? You're at a point in graveyards where I would like to say you have the right people to start looking at what you have. And I want you to look at it from the point of view you're doing it for the right reasons. Not because national monuments legislation, or not because of planning legislation or anything like that, or borough charters. They're there, okay, we have to take them into consideration. But if we're doing it for the right reasons, we're doing it because there's a tradition there that's lost, and we're doing it because our family for generations are buried in that graveyard and so on, then we're doing it for the love and care of those monuments, and that for me is a better reason than doing it because we're afraid someone will come and slap an enforcement order on us In fact, what I was wondering earlier was, when are they going to come, the authorities going to come and tell us you can't bury anyone in a graveyard? Because we can't do anything else, by the sounds of it. All I heard this morning was, you can't do this, you can't do that, you can't do something else. Sorry, Dick, Paul. But that's what it sounded like, you know. And I know you don't, you're coming from the same point as I am. We need to get away from the fear element. We need to get back to a point where we're doing it because of the right reasons, and because we're doing it, we're proud of it, and our heritage is there. Not because someone that signed the borough charter is saying to us we need to do it. It's an invisible part of our heritage. They're rusting away in our graveyards. Agreed? Do we really appreciate what we have? Does anyone here know of pieces of iron that they've passed by and didn't really realise maybe that's worth looking at properly? Have a show of hands. Good. I'm sure there's more. But it's important, guys. The ironwork, we have ironwork, and it's in danger. Now, it's not as in much danger from rusting away. It's been rusting away for the last 100 years or more. And it's not going to disappear in the next 6 months or 12 months because of rust. The skills are gone, but they can be brought back through training. The biggest danger we have, in my view, is the danger of getting in a fabricator and using modern techniques on traditional materials. That is the biggest danger. That set of gates and railings that I showed you the slide earlier, that is one of the best examples of what not to do. So the lessons, I think, in summary. We need to start opening our eyes, and you're in the ideal place to do that when you're working in graveyards. And if you have any understanding at all or any awareness of it, you'll start to see these things and start asking questions. Get to know what we have. Have a look. Maybe there's the blacksmith's initials stamped into it somewhere. Understand its importance because it's part of our unique local heritage, particularly the less sophisticated pieces. The cast iron railings and stuff like that, they were brought in. But a lot of the other stuff was more than likely made locally. I would suggest you do nothing at all unless you have the right advice. And beware that there is a difference between a blacksmith, traditional materials, and a fabricator. Don't go the fabrication route or you'll lose the lot.
But can I ask something?
Can I just let me finish and we'll come back to that in a second. Traditional materials in all ways require traditional techniques, whether it's stone, whether it's plastic, whether it's iron, whatever it is. So what's next? I would suggest doing nothing is better than losing the whole lot through bad advice. I hate saying that, but I think we have to start there. Once it's gone, it's gone. It's gone forever. It's below in Hegarty's in Limerick or some other scrapyard, and to be thrown in with the rest of the stuff, and it's gone. And it's a unique material. Seek advice, we can help. Dick knows where help can be got. We need to start looking at trying to get a better understanding, get the right advice. Thank you.